Welcome, everybody, to the Bay Area Book Festival's Architectural Insights, Revealing Layers of Meaning in Bay Area Landscapes. I'm Bianca Taylor. I'm a journalist at KQED, and I'll be your moderator today. The two books we'll be discussing will be on sale and available for signing after we finish this panel over at Pegasus Books between the MLK and Alston stages. And before we get started, a reminder to please silence your cell phones. And now for the main event, I'm joined on stage here today by John King and Eric Porter. Eric Porter is the author of A People's History of SFO, The Making of the Bay Area and an Airport. He was born and raised in Berkeley, just a few blocks away. For the past 20 years, he's taught at UC Santa Cruz, and his research interests beyond airports include Black intellectual history and jazz and improvised music. John King is the author of Portal, San Francisco's Ferry Building, and the Reinvention of American Cities. He's the San Francisco Chronicle's urban design critic, who was a history major at Cal, also just a few blocks away, before earning a master's in journalism at Indiana University. An honorary member of the American Society of Landscape Architects, he's also the author of 2 books on San Francisco architecture. So welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
So both of these books are about famous San Francisco buildings, but of course the history of a building is also the history of people and politics and power. And to get started, let's talk about the origin story of both of these buildings. What are they? You have your own microphone.
Yeah, I'll start. The one reason I decided to do a book about the Ferry Building is that the origin story really ties in from the start to the modern city of San Francisco. It was built on landfill, so the land didn't exist until the gold rush, and then after the gold rush, San Francisco built a seawall just to push out into the bay and create more space for more ships pulling up. The boomtown of the gold rush turned into the largest port on the West Coast, and then it also was the 8th largest city in the United States in 1890, but it was also surrounded by water on 3 sides, so people needed to get there. So there had been very kind of haphazard ferry service, but the building was built as really the equivalent of a grand train station bringing people into the city. And so it opened in 1898, and then from there, you had it as the defining building of the city. And then after the Golden Gate Bridge opened and the Bay Bridge opened, it was an obsolete relic that was threatened with demolition once, threatened with partial demolition several times. And then the Embarcadero Freeway, which was an early example of urban elevated freeways, was built literally across the front of it, cutting it off from Market Street and the city beyond. So it became totally obsolete, but it became a new symbol, which was a symbol of concerns about growth and overdevelopment. So that it played this odd role where it was not part of the daily life of the city, but it had this very powerful shadow on what are San Francisco values to preserve. And then after the Embarcadero Freeway came down, after the '89 earthquake, the building was reborn in a 21st century kind of Bay Area culinary sense and all. And, so that's how it came to be the Ferry Building that people know for the past 20 years.
Okay, so San Francisco's airport began life as Mills Field, a very small airfield in its current location in San Mateo County. Opened in 1927, a very simple affair in its origins, single landing strip and a few outbuildings. There's a lot of complicated history behind that. This land was reshaped in various ways during the history of settler colonialism in the Bay Area. It was originally stewarded by the Ramaytush Ohlone people. Of course, they were displaced, taken to the San Francisco Mission, which then controlled the land, grazed cattle near the site. From there, it passed onto a California ranching family named Sanchez, eventually purchased by Darius Ogden Mills, who was a very prominent, very wealthy California banker who made his fortune financing gold and silver mining. And it was in part because of his desire to pursue gentleman farming that he ended up hiring Chinese laborers to reclaim some of the salt marsh abutting his property, turned that into dry land, and that eventually became that was leased and sold to the city of leased to the city of San Francisco in 1927, eventually sold to the city, and that became the airport.
The fun thing about these books is that I'm sure every single one of us has interacted in some way with these buildings, but there's so much we don't know about them just by walking through your way to the terminal or on your way to board a ferry. What inspired you guys to write these books? And I'm going to start with you, Eric, because I know you have a personal history with SFO.
Yeah, so my grandfather was a skycap at SFO beginning in the 1940s, and it was that job that brought the African American side of my family to the Bay Area as part of the Second Great Migration. And then my father worked there briefly during summers and on weekends during high school and college. And beyond the family history, I've just been weirdly fascinated by airports for a long time. I mean, they're places that are the beginning, represent the beginnings of adventures, but they're also can be very alienating. And I've long been fascinated by how airports reflect the places where they are located. Everything from the artwork that adorns them to the cuisine, and to the ways that different marginalized people. You see different groups of marginalized people doing service work at airports, and that tells you something about who in a certain area is doing that kind of labor. So one thing led to another, and I decided to pursue this long developing goal of writing some kind of history of the Bay Area by focusing on its largest airport.
And with me, I've been at the Chronicle since the 90s, and since 2001 have been writing about architecture and urban design. And when the Ferry Building reopened in 2003, it just really struck me how it was so in tune with an aspect of the Bay Area culture at the time. But I certainly didn't think about a book until about a decade later. I helped put together an exhibit, Unbuilt San Francisco, that was at various venues in the city, and was fascinated just seeing all these crazy unbuilt things for the Bay, including tearing down the Ferry Building to build a 40-story World Trade Center there, which everybody supported. It wasn't even controversial. It was such a crazy project, it died of its own weight. And then kind of went on, and Larry Halprin, one of the great landscape architects of the 20th century, who was a Bay Area resident, he had a great idea after the freeway went up, which is we need to bring people to the waterfront, we need to reconnect to the Ferry Building, so we'll cut off the wings of the Ferry Building and create a park around it, and then people will be on Market Street and they'll look under the freeway and see there's a park and they'll walk under. And just all these crazy things just stuck with me after the exhibits ended. And more I started thinking about how the Ferry Building reflected so many aspects of kind of post-World War II San Francisco. But I kind of, as often is the case with journalists, I had an idea for a book, and then the day job intervened, and it kind of became the idea I had for the book a year or two ago. And then I was writing about sea level rise, which Eric writes about, as well in the People's History. And it kind of struck me in 2019 that, well, wait a second, the Ferry Building is not just a history book, it's also a what does the Bay Area do about sea level rise and planning for climate change. And so that's kind of what led me to think, okay, I'm going to dust off that idea.
Good catch. You both write about how these landmarks created economic opportunity and expanded Bay Area residents' access to the world and the world's access to the Bay Area. But you also write about how these buildings displaced, and the construction of these buildings and the buildings themselves displaced and disenfranchised people living in San Francisco. Can you expand on that? And how is that seen today also?
In the case of the Ferry Building, there was nothing in the way of direct displacement, except, tearing down part of the old ferry, one of the old ferry stops to build a new one. What I think it affected more is it very much was part of the connection of San Francisco to be not just a city unto itself, but to be a regional center and a major national city. And then even now in terms of the tourism and all, kind of a signal of what makes this an attractive city. So I think it's more, in the case of the Ferry Building, more kind of feeding the larger engine of what makes San Francisco so expensive, so stratified economically, and all those other aspects, that it defines an aspect of the 21st century, and that's very much a city and region where there are people who are haves and people who are have-nots.
Yeah, and I think we've seen a very similar dynamic developing with the airport, which is this huge engine for economic growth in the region in terms of how it's developed and grown hand in hand with the tech economy, with finance, and it, there are definite winners and losers. And one of the things I talk about in the book is how people struggled very hard to get good airport jobs over the years. It was originally a very discriminatory space, in terms of hiring of anyone who wasn't a white man. And through labor activism, civil rights activism, municipal affirmative action plans, things changed significantly, and it became much more accessible, both as a place to work and a place to do business. But the work that exists there is still, it runs the gamut. It's it's very uneven. There are good jobs, high-paid jobs. There are low-paid service sector jobs, and I think what we see in terms of airport employment is indicative of a broader Bay Area economy, where there's definitely people who are making it and doing quite well, given recent changes to the way of doing business here, and people who are really struggling and have been displaced. And I'll say really briefly one more thing in terms of displacement. As the airport has grown, a lot of its neighbors have had very vexed relationships to it. It has been a place where people have found work and economic opportunity, but it's also incredibly disruptive in terms of its effect on the lived environment, the noise that's produced there, the air pollution that's produced there. So, that's been an important part of the story as well. You have, some people who see this as these effects on the environment and on their everyday lived experiences as a kind of necessary cost to bear in exchange for having access to reasonable jobs if they have them. And for other people, it just represents this growing intrusion of modern life and big politics and, big big corporate power on their lives.
John, you write that the Ferry Building marks the intersection of the natural world and built terrain. And Eric, you describe SFO as growing out of the mud of the Bay tidelands. So the environment plays a big role in both of these landmarks, and I'm wondering if you can expand on that. We can start with you, Eric.
Yeah, so I just spoke a little bit about that, how right. I mean, it's the airport, right? So it has a huge effect on the environment in terms of air pollution, releasing toxins into the bay, filling the bay, the noise that it produces. So I think one of the really interesting parts of the story is the ways that community groups, environmental groups have pushed back and tried, sometimes successfully, sometimes not, to get the airport to operate in a more environmentally responsible way. And I think there's only been so much airport operators have been able to do, just given the nature of flight and all the consumption of fossil fuel and what jet engines sound like. The airport is going to be destructive. It's going to have a significant impact on the environment. But I think there's some interesting ways that the operators have tried to position themselves as stewards of the environment over the years as well, to try to ameliorate some of the effects at least.
What is an operator at the airport?
Oh, just the people in control of it. That's what I meant. Yeah,
I thought you meant,
people
like,
making decisions.
Air traffic control operators.
Well, that's part of the.
Yeah.
I mean, there's been a lot of debate about flight paths and how to get planes in and out of SFO without disrupting people who live on people's lives too much. And air traffic controllers play a role in that. And often what happens is they make one adjustment to try to lessen the effect on one group of neighbors, then it starts to affect another group more, and then there's a need to readjust even again.
Yeah, and with the ferry building, you kind of take it for granted, but if you're walking along the Embarcadero, you're walking on top of a wall that was built in the 1880s, 1890s.
That made me nervous to read.
It's hard to forget once you've read about it. So essentially in the Bay mud back in, I'm not going to go into all the details, but it kind of dates back to 1873, that up until then, all the landfill had been the SF government was not a paragon of far-sighted ethical planning at the time. And so what you could do is just get the right to build a wharf into the bay. Then you would get the right to have all the marsh along it. Then you would people would just like have floating buildings next to them and things, but there were a succession of fires that there was this wonderful description. The best part of a book is the research. And some writer in the early 50s comparing San Francisco to Venice, where it's just all these fingers of water cutting through. But something like between 1850 and 1855, there were 3 or 4 fires that just leveled the city of San Francisco, which eventually led to the realization we need to have an actual shoreline and a made-up shoreline. But so this concave or convex wall was built over the period of about 20 years, and in the mud a trench was built, or dug rather, and then just boulders and things were dumped into it to form a rough pyramid, and then the pyramid was topped with concrete, and that was the San Francisco shoreline. So the ferry building emerges, the backside of the ferry building is anchored onto the seawall and then just goes out on wooden piles. So it's a totally artificial construct, which is why with climate change, and this is true of SFO and the ferry building both, it's the how do we prepare this slapdash thing of the past for the future?
Yeah, so let's talk about climate change a little bit more as it relates to these buildings. What was thought about when these buildings were being built, and then what is the thinking now on how to mitigate it?
Well, I don't think much about climate change at all was thought about when the SFO was built, or even through many of its expansions. I think in the 1970s or so, there began to be some concern about the possibility of rising sea levels affecting the operations of airports that were built near the water, near the sea at least.
And you also had subsidence, right?
And that's another issue too. And so, as the news is getting worse and worse, and there are projections that by 2100, the bay's level will rise about 3 feet, and that's kind of a rosy estimate. And as the airport is sinking because it was built on landfill, and it's huge and made out of concrete and steel, so this is happening at the same time. The airport has been, the airport operators have been scrambling, and the city officials have been scrambling to figure out what to do. So But when I finished the book a few years ago, there was a plan in place at that time to build a large seawall, I think a 10-foot seawall around three sides of the airport. And the airport was in negotiations with some of its neighbors to the west as to what to do about the west side of the facility. We'll see. We'll see what will happen. This is something that's going on across the Bay Area, right, where different private entities, municipal entities, county governments are trying to figure out how to deal with sea level rise in terms of bay water. And there are some interesting conversations about trying to coordinate efforts, and that's probably, I think, obviously the best approach, because one of the things that can happen if entities go it alone, say if SFO decides to just build its own seawall, then the water that gets displaced that doesn't flow onto the SFO property will get diverted elsewhere, and quite possibly into the cities that surround it, or very likely into the cities that surround it, or potentially 20 miles away on the other side of the bay, so. We'll see. It's a complicated, expensive, vexing situation that's just going to get more so in the coming years.
And with the Ferry Building and Embarcadero, you have this different thing where essentially it's locked in place. But it's locked in place to be a few feet above high tides in the 1890s. So with this changing and with storms getting more extreme, that becomes the whole challenge of what to do. The current things, I did a piece last week exploring this a bit more, but the logical thing to do is to hike the whole ferry building up about 7.5 feet and raise the entire Embarcadero seawall about 3.5 to 7 feet. And the catch, of course, is that if you build a 10-foot high seawall out beyond the runways of SFO, it's just this thing off in the distance you don't notice. But if you were going to go meet a friend for coffee and
oysters,
and you're staring at a wall that's several feet higher than what's there now, it totally destroys what's evolved along the water. So there's kind of the thing that engineers say needs to be done, and the challenge is how does that get worked out politically, and then unlike SFO, which generates so much money to itself, the Port of San Francisco has a mammoth deferred maintenance cost, and it kind of struggles very much in terms of financing things. So it's going to be such an interesting tension point for the next 5 or 6 years.
Going back a little bit, what are some notable architectural details that you discovered while writing about both of these buildings?
Super quick, the Ferry Building's pretty self-obvious, the big arches, the clock tower and everything. What I did the one thing I discovered is I was able to go up in the tower, and going back to when the architect A. Page Brown did his first presentation on the Ferry Building, the idea was, and in the course of doing this, we want to have people come up to the top of the tower and have a public observation place. And that idea came about when the building was redone in the 50s, and it came about when a mammoth Southern California real estate investment trust bought the lease in 2017. The catch is if you actually go up there, which I finally got to do, it's a very narrow, dingy attic that happens to be it's an 8-story tall attic that's very narrow with stairs going down the middle of it. So there's no way you could put anything in it to make it accessible. And the only thing it's been used for in terms that I could find in terms of public visits was when now King Charles III visited the Ferry Building in 2006 or whatever. There were government sharpshooters positioned up in the tall open area so that if there was an assassination attempt, they could take the whoever it is out. But it's like, other than that, people don't really get up there much.
Yeah.
So answer your question by just talking not so much about architecture, but about the public art and museum exhibits at the airport, which are quite fascinating. I had noticed these, just passing through the airport from time to time, but there's this very interesting history by which this public art program started, and what eventually became SFO started in the 1970s. Got a lot of attention and became very well established, in part because in the context of post-Proposition 13 budget cuts for arts programming, there's a lot of refocus on what the airport was able to do in terms of instituting exhibitions of permanent and temporary exhibitions of different kinds. Because they kept generating revenue and could afford to do these things when other city entities couldn't do these things.
So you mentioned this, but doing research is the most fun part of writing. Definitely not the writing. So these buildings have so many stories to tell. What is your favorite or most surprising story that you learned while you were researching these books?
Well, I can start. So much has been a surprise because I didn't really know anything about airports before I started writing this book. So just in terms of, histories of regulations, the extent to which airports as infrastructures really took off, no pun intended, during the New Deal because they were funded with WPA and Public Works Administration funds. And, the list goes on. But I think maybe the most interesting thing that I found out when doing this book is that there's a really interesting history of protest at SFO around a pretty wide range of issues related to the way we live our lives in the Bay Area. People are probably familiar with the 2017 protests against President Trump's so-called Muslim ban, but there had been earlier protests about travel restrictions placed on different kinds of people. In the 1980s, because of the restrictions that airlines placed on travelers with AIDS, that there was a lot of activism, people showing up and sort of outing themselves as people with AIDS, insisting on buying tickets for a flight to call attention to these discriminatory policies. Local anti-jet noise activists. Actually, speaking of Prince Charles, or King Charles, formerly Prince Charles, in the 1970s when he was visiting the Bay Area and about to leave, these local activists who were, struggling against jet noise in the area, drove a bunch of cars into the airport and did a kind of slowdown to block traffic. At the time, there was a lot of press focused on the airport because of the prince's visit to call attention to their issue. So there's a long list of protests that are really interesting.
And one of the things I found there was, we have the Ferry Building now. There are the finger piers to the north and south, but some are still parking garages. Some have been redone and everything, the Exploratorium, for instance. But back in the mid-'30s, when San Francisco had the waterfront strike that really triggered and activated the whole West Coast waterfront strikes, I think it was 34, maybe 35, reading about what ended up with them killing, the police shooting, and basically shooting to pretty much almost ambushing labor strikers after several months of growing tensions, was to see how close the Ferry Building was. So much part of the working waterfront, but it was this whole separate world. It was this commute depot into the city for visitors, workers, and everything. And then there were all these finger piers up and down where there were all the fights over unionization, over how could workers have some say in where they worked and even knowing that they were going to work. So before the strike, one of the things that drove it to the strike, there was something called the horseshoe, where if I was a member of a longshoreman's, the union was having trouble getting going, but if I was a longshoreman, I would show up at like 4 a.m., and you would stand outside the Ferry Building, and there was this horseshoe where the shape was determined by the hiring agents for different shipping companies. And then they all had to be gone by the time morning commuters started coming in. So you might show up and there might only be 3 shippers who needed it that day. So you had no work and you basically had to be gone by 8 a.m. During the strike, the main fighting was on the south side of the Embarcadero, south of Market Street. And during the climactic day or two leading up to the killings, which then led to a general strike in San Francisco, so many people who worked downtown or who were shopping downtown were standing in the colonnade of the Ferry Building, all the arches outside, just to watch what was going on. It's kind of like, oh, look, there's a labor battle going on today. Let's all go to the Ferry Building and watch. And policemen on horses rode through just to scatter people, not because there was fighting going on there, but there were like hundreds of gawkers watching this, one of the most pitched labor battles the West Coast ever saw.
Thank you. So I think we can open it up to audience questions now. I'm not sure how that works exactly. Is there, I think, yeah, we'll grab a mic so you don't have to shout. Back right corner.
Thank you. Hi, John King. This question is for you. My name's Karen Buchanan. Grew up in San Francisco. Been reading you in the Chronicle for 25 years or so. And I worked at the World Trade Center part of the Ferry Building from 1985 to 87 for get this, a cellular telephone startup company.
I've actually heard about that. I know someone else who worked there as a summer intern.
Romulus Engineering, and they became Mobile Telephone Corporation, right? I was their office manager. Anyway, so I loved working in that building. It was a fantastic restoration, what they did. And thank you for writing this important book. I can't wait to buy a signed copy.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Hi, John. I know the man who has the contract to maintain the clock at the tower, and he's told me that prior to 9/11, he could take people up and show them the clock, but now it's been secured, and he can't take me up there.
Yeah, to get up there, you have to have the building, the one who owns the lease, take you up, sign you in, get all the releases and things like that. So it's like the airport. It's not as loosey-goosey as it used to be.
We have a question.
Yeah, this is also a question for Mr. King. When I was a little girl, I remember going to the Ferry Building and seeing this huge 3D map of the entire state of California in one of the, I think it was on an upper floor. And what happened to that thing? Is it still around? Is it in storage?
Yeah, part of doing this book is I left so much out of it just because I wanted to keep the narrative going. And I left that out, and you're about the 6th or 8th person who's mentioned having seen it and what happened to it. The last trace I saw of it was that it was taken out when the south half of the building was renovated in the early 60s. It had kind of spread throughout. Then the World Trade Center was done at the north half. It was pushed down to the south half. Then the port redid the south half. And somebody up in far northern California bought it and was going to do something big with it, according to the news story at the time. And I'm sure somebody knows where it is, but I don't.
So I've been lucky enough to be in that very top little tower of the Ferry Building, and I was stunned on the way up the level before, all the graffiti, some going back 100 years, various business cards from various city-affiliated, probably construction companies, entities, whatever. But what's, on that very top top space. There's only like space for like maybe 2 people. And so you've been up there, the full thing?
I didn't actually like go to the very top. I stopped like, I went past the clock, and it was kind of, do you want to step outside and walk around? And my answer was 2 letters. So that's as far as I got.
It's a little iffy up there, but it is amazing view. And the interior, I wish there was some documentation of all that and photos for the world to see and share, because it's so crazy seeing these signatures. And mine
Again,
is
it's
Joe,
like an attic. It's so matter of
1875
fact.
or whatever.
It's so matter of fact up there. It's not some sacred space. It's just the attic where people stuff things.
Okay, we've got a couple questions in the front here.
Thank you. I actually really love the stories about, even though my background is architecture, I really love the stories about people, and especially the protests. And thank you for shouting out, Eric, the Muslim ban. Though my question is actually about climate, but not so much the localized impacts of aviation and shipping, which both of these buildings are connected to. And one is sort of at the start of us seeing the world change, and I don't want to be provocative, but I'm going to ask a question, like, why do we need to save these buildings? Why do we need to save these places, both the airport and the Ferry Building, especially thinking about how much resources it would take to build these walls to save them? Like, what is the value of saving them? And you've written the history. If you had the power, what did you learn from writing these histories? That how would sort of you approach this idea of like why they need to be saved, or how they need to be saved, or how can they be repurposed? Does the airport in the future become one giant food court like the Ferry Building is to some? So thank you.
I'll start. I mean, that is a provocative question. I don't think I'm arguing for saving the airport in this book, but it is, this is something that we as a society have to contend with. To what extent are we going to continue to rely on these different transportation infrastructures that burn fossil fuels? And compared to other things like coal plants and automobiles, aviation doesn't burn that much, although it's a significant amount. And there are certainly people out there that argue that perhaps we need to rely more on aviation for transporting goods and travel and less on other forms of transportation. But it's still a downward slide into a climate change abyss. The airport is making, both locally and nationally, there are, there's a lot of work being done on more efficient engines. People are trying to develop renewable jet fuels and the like, and it's promising on one level, but I think all it really means is that things won't get worse as quickly. So I kind of like the vision of the airport as a food corridor, and maybe after the sea level rises a bit, aquatic reserve.
We could make it sort of a Sutro bath, like a reborn Sutro bath with bay water.
Yeah, and in terms of the Ferry Building, it's the pure need to save. It ties to the seawall, which is, I did mention that the Army Corps is now part of the effort to look at the San Francisco waterfront. And the Army Corps says to protect it the next 50 years or so would be a $13 billion project, of which the federal government, if it gets through Congress, which is a Pandora's box of other issues, the feds would pay 2/3. The thing is, though, the reason the Army Corps wants to get involved and says we are willing to do this is it measures it strictly by the cost of flooding. And if we do not do something, what's the financial damage? And in the case of the seawall, if the seawall, it will never collapse, but if it was to really degrade, you've got the entire San Francisco financial district south of Market area at risk. So then it's a very, it's kind of the devil's bargain dating back hundreds of years, which is, you could argue, nature wants to reclaim the old shoreline, but there are so much invested value right there. It's kind of, well, we can't do that. So.
Thank you. One more question over here.
Okay. I also want to thank you, John, for your column, which I've appreciated through the years. And I was just thinking the Chronicle is unusual, actually, in having an architectural commentator. But
Could you reposition the microphone a little bit? Yeah.
but I had another kind of practical question. Regardless of climate change and sea level rise, you mentioned that the Ferry Building is based on wooden pylons. Those are not eternal. What happens to them?
That's part of the whole issue of raising, would be to kind of get around that. The crazy thing is they continue to test remarkably well because they're all in the mud, so they haven't been exposed to tides. The concrete foundation, which is it's like a catacomb-like arch system, goes down into the mud. The things were driven down. I don't know how they did it, and I wrote the book on it. They drove them down. They built like a little wooden box. They poured concrete into it, lifted it out, took away the box. So the wood is, there's no air gets to the pylon. So they, in fact, do continue to survive. They've been, as you can imagine, every time there's been significant work done, or after an earthquake, the work's been done with a question of, well, maybe now it's time to do something. And so far, they come out of the testing great. Except the BART tunnel is driven through the Ferry Building foundation. Just another twist.
Okay, another question?
I just wanted to ask Dr. Porter, you mentioned the art at the San Francisco airport. Like, I know there's a Kaneko ceramics, Butterfield horses. It's an extensive collection, and they actually have rotating exhibits. And I was wondering if that funding was sort of built into the San Francisco airport, or how are we so blessed to have such an extensive art collection and ongoing, exhibits?
Okay, so there's two parts of that. There are these permanent pieces of public art that are acquired by the airport and installed there. And then there is this, what SFO Museum does, which is to have these rotating temporary exhibits. And, I think a lot of that, some of it is, if I understand it correctly, if my memory is correct, after working on this a couple of years ago, there's a part of the city charter in terms of funding public building requires that a certain amount or up to a certain amount should be put aside for public art, and that funds at least the permanent the permanent public artworks at the museum. And this is, this money is perpetually being put into the airport, often from user fees, fees that the airlines pay to use the facility, but also through bond measures and the like. And I think those same sources provide funding for the temporary exhibitions as well. And, the idea is that, it's supposed to make the airport experience better for people who use it, travelers and workers alike. It's, I think part of the airport as a municipal institution's efforts to support the arts locally. And I think it's also, designed in part to, chill people out who are at the airport and often experiencing stresses of various kinds as they're running, late for flights or worried about making connections or just generally afraid of flying, just to give them something to enjoy at the facility.
We have time for one last question. Okay. Third row back there.
Thank you very much for doing this. And I go to the Ferry Building every week. on Saturdays for the farmers market. So I want to keep it. Thank you.
Okay, and with that, unless you two have any last remarks,
Thank you all for coming.
yes,
Yes,
thank
thank
you all
you.
for
Appreciate
coming.
you being here.
And these books will be sold by Pegasus Books between the MLK stage and Alston stage. They will be there to sign them. And there's really awesome photos, historical photos in the books. So if you are sort of trying to get a mental image of what these things may have looked like, recommend checking the books out. Thank you.